Hello, rocket builders. As I promised you last time, today we're going to talk about centering rings, which leads to the question, what is a centering ring? Well, a centering ring solves the problem of mounting a small tube inside a larger tube, because it's a firm structure around the outside. But as with everything in this project, things aren't always so simple. So stay tuned and we'll see some fun construction techniques. Remember folks, I've been certified to build and fly rockets up to level 3. If you don't have these qualifications, you might want to consider a simpler project and perhaps join one of your local or national organizations. Rocketry is a very safe hobby if you follow some very simple guidelines. In this image, we have an example of not one, but two centering rings. In the center, we have a blue tube, which needs to fit inside a larger diameter blue tube. So we have the plywood centering ring that manages that. We also have a larger centering ring designed to place the outer blue tube inside the fiberglass body tube that we showed you how to make last week. So this is an example of the sort of complications that we have in this project. Some of our body tubes are just plain large. Some of them have unusual shapes, but they're all unique. In some cases, it was easy. For the blue tubes, for example, they produce a centering ring that is specifically designed to mount the 3-inch blue tube into the 5.5-inch blue tube. It's a laser cut plywood part. I ordered that when I ordered the blue tube. So how do we go about manufacturing these? Well, this is the first attempt. I used a simple hole cutting saw in some thin plywood just as proof of concept, and it had mixed results. So looking at a centering ring that would allow the fuel tanks to be mounted outside of the center core blue tube, we used a hole cutter of the correct diameter and we cut 8 holes. Okay. Now, as you can see, there was some overlap between those holes. So while we got a good mounting bracket to maintain the position of the fuel tanks around that Bluetooth core, it really isn't sufficient as a centering ring general solution. Additionally, problems with the hole cutting saws. One is it tended to slip, so they weren't always very precise. But the most important limitation is, as I started cutting with thicker plywoods, the hole saws tended to bind. It didn't matter if I used them slowly or tried to do quickly, it would bind and send the plywood actually flying off of the drill press. Not only was it dangerous, it just plain didn't produce the results I needed. Confounded a little by this, I looked online for solutions and I came across this router cutting jig. And it is designed to cut circles anywhere from about 2.5 inches up to over 18 inches in 1/16 inch increments. So this looked pretty ideal for me. It can cut outer rings, so things such as just cutting a disc where you have to cut outside, and inner rings such as the holes where the body tubes would be placed. The jig is calibrated for a 1/4 inch bit, but you are going to have to adjust depending on whether you're cutting an inner or an outer hole. And that leads to some complications as well, as I'll show you shortly. Outer rings are pretty easy. You can double check the diameter, and I strongly suggest you do. Now what you do is you drill a pilot hole in the center of the ring, and there's a pin for the jig that fits into that hole, and then you cut around it. Now, in order to do this, you need what's known as a plunge router. This is one where you actually push down on the router to bring the bit into the plywood. And there's a special bit for this as well. I'll have links to all of that below. Okay, then you start cutting the inner rings. Now, this is tedious. You have to cut a guide hole for each of the inner cuts. You have to make sure that your router jig is on the correct setting. You plunge, you make. Okay. For the most complex of these, I had 9 inner holes, 1 for the main stuffer tube and 8 for each of the fuel tanks. Some of them had less. So we now have centering rings with the holes cut. At this point, you want to double check your sizes. As I did this, I found that my initial cuts were actually incorrectly measured. I had to start the whole process again. Now bear in mind, for all of these centering rings, I'd already spent anywhere from 6 to 8 hours cutting them, so I was facing another full day of work. So the standard adage applies: measure twice, cut once. I cut twice. Okay, so for our purposes, even a 1/4 inch plywood isn't really sufficient. So what I did in this case is I actually reinforced those plywood centering rings with carbon fiber on either side. I created 2 layers of carbon fiber with the grains, if you will, of the carbon fiber at a 45-degree offset, so that we wouldn't have reinforcing weak points. They would actually reinforce each other and add extra strength. Now, when you create these, I did not use vacuum bagging because the limited vacuum bagging equipment I had, which I'll show you later, isn't large enough to accommodate a ring of this size. So this was just a straight up, put on the carbon fiber, epoxy it down, wick up what you can, but just lay it flat and let it cure. At the leather stage, as you can see in this image, I did cut out the carbon fiber from the center of the rings, but it will still need some trimming with the Dremel tool in order to be useful. And that's true anyway, because I needed to trim the holes to a more precise size. That's approximately what I needed here, but not exactly. Some of them had extra needs. For example, for the base plate, I needed cutouts where I could add the mounting posts for the wiring, which would allow for cluster ignition. Okay, so I cut out a couple of squares in the base plate and added a plywood portion on the back with a hole that would allow me to pass wiring through. I then used mounting screws to reattach those to the base plate. Okay. So here we can see some test fittings using our fuel tanks. As I said, the fit isn't precise. You have to adjust a little bit with a Dremel and a sanding wheel, but it's certainly a very good way to go. It is time consuming, however. Most of our motor mounts were pretty standard. There was a main support round piece that went into the outer body tube, and then anywhere from 1 to 9 holes inside that would mount things like fuel tanks, stuffer tubes, and so on. We did have one special case, however, which is used for the outer 38mm cluster motors, and we'll talk about more about why this is required when we talk about clustering. But for those, they needed a off-center inner hole. Now, this required a little more precision, and it was certainly a lot smaller than what I could produce with my router jig. So what I did in this case is I actually sent it out to have them laser cut. With the 4 motor mounts, I needed 8 of these centering rings. And again, we'll talk about why we need that when we look at clustering. So what do you do when you mess up? And if you're like me, you will. Well, make a cup holder. So, you thought centering rings were simple. Well, fundamentally they are. But in a project like this, even simple things can become complicated, and you need to plan these things out in advance. So consider that as you start your next large build. Until then, have fun building.